Hello everyone, and welcome back. Today I am giving you a video that was inspired by the Harry Potter A History of Magic audiobook, which explores some of the hidden stories behind real-world magic and J.K. Rowling's inspiration. It sounds obvious because a lot of us know mostly about witchcraft from Harry Potter and other fantasy movies like Hocus Pocus, The Craft, The Wizard of Oz, etc. But witchcraft in real life has had very negative connotations, so much so that witches were given death sentences to cleanse the society. In my video today, we will be looking at some stories of famous witches in our history. Be warned though, that some of the stories can be a little unsettling. I hope you enjoy this sudden trip to the past. Our first witch encounter is in 1324 with Dame Alice KYTELER, also known as Kettle. She is the first woman recorded to be accused of being a witch. However, interestingly, she wasn't the first to be burned, but rather her servant, Petronilla de Meath. To give a little context in this fascinating story, we are taken to the thriving and prosperous trading town Kilkenny in Ireland, where a growing struggle between religious and secular authorities would soon give way to the accusations of witchcraft, specifically targeting prominent women in the community. The date, of course, precedes actual laws against witchcraft, but anything of this sort was punished under heresy through the church. Heresy being a denial of faith in Christ and a rejection of the hierarchy of the church and its professed dogmas and doctrines. The dominant Christian church of this period had blamed many fantastic and impossible crimes on the heretics, and any resistance to established political or social authorities, as well as any eccentric behaviour from the norm, was prosecuted as heresy. Alice KYTELER's case, nevertheless, would foreshadow what is to come following from the end of the Middle Ages, the hunt for witches in much of Western Europe, which would take on larger proportions and continue for more than 2 centuries afterwards. Alice KYTELER did not exactly fit the typical description of a witch. You know, the sinister old woman with striking ugliness or extreme deformities. She must have been an attractive woman, for she did indeed marry 4 times, and to important noblemen. Her marital status became quite scandalous in the town, and one of the defining factors for which she was accused of sorcery. Her first husband was William OUTLAWE, who was a banker. With him, she had her first son, a son also called William. Her husband became ill and died suddenly within a few years of marriage. Shortly afterwards, Alice married her second husband, Adam de BLUND of CULLEN, who was a moneylender. She had children with him also. However, Adam too happened to die suddenly and mysteriously. This left Alice free to marry her third husband, Richard de Vale, and the pattern continued with his early, sudden, and mysterious death. Alice then looked for a new husband. This time it would be Sir John le Poer, a wealthy landowner. Obviously, the pattern of Dame Alice's husband's deaths were raising questions, especially because, although she was wealthy before her marriages, the estates of 3 husbands had enriched her considerably. It was of course not long before her 4th husband, John le Poer, was becoming sick. It is even said that he had suspicions that he was being poisoned. Before he died, he made sure that he had changed his will, leaving everything to his wife, soon-to-be widow Alice, and the eldest and allegedly the favourite son, William OUTLAWE. Where it gets interesting is that Sir John Le Poer had been married before, with a family. So the change in his will sparked outrage and anger, as they were no longer to inherit anything. Alice's stepchildren went to Richard de la Drede, who was the Bishop of Ossory at the time. They told him that things were not as they should be, with high suspicions that Dame Alice had bewitched their father and made him take leave of his senses, in addition to hints that she had poisoned him and her previous husband also. It is important to note that a poisoner had the same connotations as a witch, for they both implied the knowledge of herbs. With this information, Richard de la Drede promised to investigate, so he gathered a court of inquisition formed of 5 knights and several noblemen to examine the facts. Some sources state that Bishop de la Drede was trying to establish the rule of the church in Kilkenny, and that he was obsessed with the occult and witchcraft. Conveniently, Alice's case would allow him to exercise on his obsessions. The findings from the Inquisition were quite shocking. They had found a band of heretical sorcerers, in other words, a group of witches, at the head of whom was Dame Alice KYTELER. The following charges were laid against them. They had denied the faith of Christ, believing in none of the doctrines of Christ. They made sacrifices to demons and offered disemboweled animals, which they distributed at crossroads in honour of a spirit of low rank named Robin, son of Art, also known as Artisan. They had also sought by their sorcery encouragement and response from the demons. In their nightly meetings, they had blasphemously imitated the power of the church by, under candlelight, conjuring sentences of excommunication against their own husbands, from the soles of their feet to the crown of their heads, specifically naming each part expressively, and then concluding by extinguishing the candles and crying, "Fie, fie, fie, Amen." In order to arouse feelings of love or hatred, or to inflict death or disease on the bodies of the faithful, they made use of powders, ointments, and candles of fat, which were created as follows. They took the entrails of cocks sacrificed to demons, certain horrible worms, various unspecified herbs, dead men's nails, their hair, brains, and shreds of the cerements of boys who are buried unbaptized, with other abominations, all of which they cooked with various incantations over a fire of oak logs in a vessel made of the skull of a decapitated thief. The children of Dame Alice's 4 husbands accused her of having harmed their fathers through sorcery, and bewitching them all into leaving their fortunes to her and her eldest son, William Outlaw. They also stated that her present husband, Sir John Le Poer, had become abnormally weak through powder and poison. His nails had dropped off, and there was no hair left on his body. He had then been warned by a maidservant of Alice's magic. That same maidservant had given the bishop a sackful of detestable and horrible things, which were found in Alice's possession. On top of this, Alice was said to have a certain demon, an incubus, named Robin, son of Art, who had carnal knowledge of her and is suggested to be the one who provided her with all her wealth. The demon was said to have made frequent and often violent appearances in various forms, such as a cat, a fierce and hairy black dog, or as 3 Ethiopians carrying iron rods. Several people claimed to have seen Alice sweeping the streets of the town with a long broomstick between sunset and sunrise, trying to beckon the town's wealth to her son, with an incantation which went, "To the house of women, and I will go where the children sound." Of course, from all of these claims that were presented to the bishop, he was quick to conclude and confirm the paranoia of witchcraft. The Bishop Richard de la Drede immediately wrote to the Chancellor of Ireland, Roger Outlaw, requesting the arrest of these people, including Dame Alice and her son, William, soon formed a strong party opposing the bishop's demands, and among them were of course the Chancellor himself, being a near relative, as well as Arnold le POER, the Seneschal of Kilkenny, also an akin to Dame Alice's late husband. The Chancellor wrote back, stating that the arrest could not happen unless the accused had been publicly excommunicated by the church for 40 days. Meanwhile, Sir Arnold le POER also wrote to the bishop, asking him to withdraw the case or ignore it. Infuriated by the lack of support, the bishop decided to take matters into his own hands. With Alice out of his reach, the bishop excommunicated her and moved his attention towards William Outlaw by summoning him to appear before him in 17 days, citing him for heresy. In response to this, William and Arnold le POER went to the place in which Bishop de la Drede was holding the visitation, and Arnold demanded as seneschal that he should not proceed any further with the allegations and threatened the bishop with arrest. This threat became pretty much a reality, because the bishop was arrested and jailed for 17 days in order to avoid William's arrest. This raised quite a lot of attention and controversy. Many churchmen flocked to visit de la Drede in jail and to show their support for the bishop. In his official status, the bishop had placed an interdict on Kilkenny. This meant that no leading figure, especially those involved in his arrest, were allowed to receive sacrament, also meaning no mass could be held while this interdict was in place. He made a spectacle of being able to receive the sacrament himself, and was getting a lot of public attention, which worried William Outlaw, as Bishop de la Drede was becoming something of a martyr. After the 17 days had passed, Arnold le POER had the bishop released, pleased that William would no longer be arrested. The bishop, however, had more conviction than ever to insist on getting a proper hearing, and wanted William to answer for the allegations against him of heresy. Curiously, however, the day before William was to appear before the bishop again, the bishop himself was cited to appear before the ecclesiastical court to answer a charge for unlawfully having placed an interdict on the town on Kilkenny. In response to this, the bishop pleaded that he could go to Dublin, where the court was to be held, in fear for his life travelling through Arnold de POER's lands. Arnold then seized the opportunity to accuse the bishop of the same and have him face the court. The court took place during Easter, and although Bishop de la Drede arrived, he was denied entrance. In light of this, de la Drede forced his way in and demanded that he be granted a fair hearing, which was apparently granted, not that it pleased Arnold at all. The court then allegedly descended into a spectacle that gave neither the church nor the civil authorities any credit. There was shouting and insults, but the proceedings were stopped before there was any violence. Meanwhile, we come back to Dame Alice KYTELER, who, being out of the watchful eye, had returned from England to Dublin, where she persuaded the Archbishop to convene a court against Bishop Richard de la Drede for unlawfully excommunicating her from the church upon an unproven charge of witchcraft. Because of this, the bishop presented himself to the court with the Archbishop and was found to have committed an error, so had to lift the excommunication. Bishop de la Drede was not going to give up so easily, however. As soon as he returned to Kilkenny from Dublin, he wrote a letter to Roger Outlaw, directing that he arrest Dame Alice, who was still in Dublin. He had also written to the Vicar General of the Archbishop in Dublin, demanding that she be returned to Kilkenny to answer for her arrest for witchcraft. Funnily enough, Dame Alice somehow found out about these letters and took the opportunity to flee to England again, this time leaving behind witchcraft allegations which persisted. On Della Dread's orders, many of her alleged followers were arrested for witchcraft, most of them from humble origins. When Bishop Della Dread went to question the prisoners, they admitted to their guilt straight away, confessing their blasphemous crimes, as well as admitting to other crimes they hadn't been questioned for at all. All the while, they made a point of mentioning that Dame Alice was mother and mistress to them all. Loaded with this evidence, Della Dread immediately wrote to Roger Outlaw, as Chancellor of Ireland, and Walter de Islep, the Treasurer, to request that the witches be lodged in jail pending their trial. The Chancellor refused to issue the warrant, probably because the named in the group of witches was William Outlaw, who was a relative and close friend. This was no issue for Della Dread anymore, as he managed to get it through the Justiciary of Ireland, who said he would deal with the case upon arriving to Kilkenny. Before the arrival of the Justiciary, Bishop Della Dread summoned William Outlaw to answer for charges of witchcraft at St. Mary's Church. William indeed arrived, but not alone. With him he brought a band of men armed to the teeth. Unfazed by this, Bishop Della Dread formally accused him of being a witch and a heretic. He accused him of favouring, receiving, and defending heretics, as well as usury, perjury, adultery, and a number of crimes and blasphemies. A total of 37 charges were brought forward against him. William was only allowed to respond to these claims upon the arrival of the Justiciary. Once the Justiciary reached Kilkenny, accompanied by the Chancellor Roger Outlaw, the Treasurer Walter Islep, and the King's Council, in their presence of Bishop Della Dread, recited these charges against Dame Alice KYTELER, and under the common consent of the lawyers present, she was declared a sorceress, magician, and a heretic. Conceited, Bishop Della Dread demanded that Alice be handed over to the authorities. This never happened, as she was missing, and have her goods and personal possessions confiscated. This allegedly happened on July 2nd, on the same day the bishop made a great fire in the middle of town, in which he burnt all the possessions which were confiscated from her, including the sack full of magical items, which was given to Alice's late husband, John Lepore. Items including powders, ointments, human nails, hair, herbs, worms, and other abominations. William was not off the hook. Even though the Chancellor and Treasurer tried to back him up, the bishop was triumphant in making William Outlaw bend the knee for penance, and he was ordered to hear at least 3 masses every day for a whole year, to feed the poor out of his own pocket, as well as repairing the roof of St. Canice's Cathedral, as well as the chapels of the Blessed Virgin. William agreed to all of these conditions, but soon neglected his obligations and was subsequently thrown in prison. The Bishop Della Dread, of course, feeling triumphant in having dealt with William, still felt the hunger for getting to Dame Alice, for she was still out there and free. With this thirst for incriminating the occult, he went after Alice's followers. What happened to most of them is unknown, except for one, Petronella de Meath. Remember I mentioned her at the beginning? She was Dame Alice's closest servant and friend. What Petronella de Meath was destined for was rather dark, as it was against her that the bishop used his most stringent torture. He had her flogged 6 times, and under the repeated form of torture, Petronella was forced to confess to have been involved in practicing magic. She admitted the denial of her faith and the sacrificing to the demon Robin, son of Art, as well as that she had caused a certain woman that she knew to appear as though she had goat horns. She also confessed that at the suggestion of Dame Alice, she frequently consulted demons and received responses from them, and that she had acted as a medium between her and the demon Robin. She declared that even though she herself was a mistress of the black arts, she was nothing in comparison to Dame Alice KYTELER, who had taught her all her knowledge, and in fact, there was no one else as skillful in witchcraft than Dame Alice. She also made an effort to implicate William Outlaw, stating that he deserved the death penalty, for he had taken part in the worship of demons, and that for a whole year he had worn the Devil's Girdle, or magic belt, in order to gain secular power. Acting on Petronella's detailed accounts, and that of the rumours of Alice, Bishop Della Dread searched Dame Alice's house, where they found hidden away a wafer of sacramental bread stamped with the devil's name instead of Jesus Christ's, as well as a pipe with ointment with which they would use to grease a wooden beam, which was also found that allegedly enabled them to fly. Of course, this was enough evidence of her guilt, and consequently Bishop Della Dread finally condemned Petronella de Meath to the worst punishment, and that was to be burnt alive. This took place on the 3rd of November 1324 in Kilkenny, Ireland. It is possible that the other followers of Dame Alice who were captured were also burnt and punished, but there aren't any records of that. What is still unknown is what did happen to Dame Alice KYTELER. There is actually an inn/medieval bar in Kilkenny, Ireland, whose original owner was apparently Alice KYTELER, and they often witness ghost activity, and think that it could be Dame Alice KYTELER coming back. If you don't believe me, check out the links below to their website, and see some very unsettling photos of a shadow that was caught on camera. And if you're feeling braver, please visit the inn and let me know what your thoughts were. In this next story, I bring you to the 1400s in England to meet the famous witch Agatha Southgale and her daughter-born Ursula Southgale, later known as Mother Shipton. Sadly, little is actually known about Agatha, except for the fact that she died very young after giving birth to her daughter Ursula. The significant element in her story is that she gave birth to her daughter at the age of 15 in a cave near Knaresborough, Yorkshire, England. The cave is now known as Mother Shipton's Cave. Agatha was widely regarded as a witch because she was such an outcast, and because her daughter was allegedly born so deformed and hideously ugly. But why did she give birth in a cave? It seems that Agatha was described as an orphan of slothful and idle tendencies. She was constantly mocked and scorned by other women in the town for her loose morals. There is also some evidence that while she was pregnant, she was trialed as a common prostitute. When she became pregnant out of wedlock at such a young age, she was victimized so badly by the townsfolk that she fled to the cave by the Dropping Well by Knaresborough on the opposite side of the River Nid to give birth. It was apparently a stormy time. This place was shunned by the town because of the mysterious, petrifying way the water runs down the cliff into the well. Many superstitious people feared the cave, and to this day, because Ursula was born there, It is said people believe she was sired by the devil at birth. The reason many people came to this horrifying conclusion was because Ursula, or as we know her, Mother Shipton, was supposedly born grotesquely deformed and absolutely hideous. Accounts state that her head was too large, that she had googling eyes that glowed like embers, her cheeks were apparently sunken, and her limbs were twisted and deformed. It is also said that she was born with a full set of teeth, which protruded like tusks of a boar. According to local accounts, she was often called Hagface or Devil's Bastard as she grew up, as people believed that someone so ugly must be the child of the devil himself. Despite her apparently unfortunate appearance, she was taken in by a kind woman. Nevertheless, rumors still followed her, so much so that they say she apparently plagued the cottage she grew up in. Strange events frequently occurred, like furniture rearranging itself, plates being flung out, and food would apparently disappear before the eyes of mealtime guests. Other tales say that if she was angered or pushed to her limits, she would conjure up goblins and dragons and scare people away. On one occasion, she was warned that her activities could get her burnt as a witch, and in response to this, she put her wooden staff in the fire, but it had no effect. And to this, she supposedly said, "If this had burnt, I might have too." So, she was rather daring. As a result of the town's bullying, Ursula grew up as a lonely child, reduced to focus on her inner world. She was very connected with nature, the forest, and her own thoughts. All of her life was connected with the cave she was born in, and here she practiced her craft, searching for visions, intentionally or not, and creating mysterious legends about herself. Additionally to this, even though her appearance didn't improve, this did not prevent her from meeting Toby Shipton, a carpenter who she would marry and lead a very comfortable life with. Inevitably, people still rumored she'd used a love potion on him. They didn't have any children, but it seemed that Toby was very accepting of Mother Shipton's witchy instincts, especially those of her unusual skills to see into the future. Toby was not the only one who was impressed by Mother Shipton's clairvoyance. Many people began to hold her visions in high regard, even as high as another famous clairvoyant named Nostradamus, famous for supposedly predicting the Great Fire of London, and he allegedly also predicted the tragic recent event of the fire in Notre Dame, Paris. Mother Shipton's early predictions were to do with her local people, and as word travelled, she began to receive clients who had travelled to Knaresborough just to receive a prediction from her. She was very successful in solving interpersonal issues. Apparently even thieves would return the goods they had stolen and apologize to the rightful owners to repent for their sins. Wandering husbands would beg for forgiveness and rectify their old ways. As time passed, however, she became wiser, and her predictions became more ambitious. Her prophecies were amongst the highly discussed topics in the 17th century British royal court. One of the most famous stories connected with the court is about Cardinal Wolsey, Mithrid Peacock. According to Mother Shipton's vision, he would see York without reaching it. In 1530, Wolsey got on the wrong side of the king and set out to find refuge in the north. He was within sight of York when suddenly Lord Percy arrived with the king's summons, calling him back to London to face the charge of high treason. How is it that a woman in Knaresborough could know anything about this? Mother Shipton's reputation had remained because of her visions, which foretold events in a more distant future. For example, she allegedly predicted the execution of Mary Queen of Scots in addition to foreseeing Lady Jane Grey becoming queen, although this only lasted 9 days, as she was killed. It is said that Mother Shipton also envisioned Drake's defeat of the Spanish Armada, the Great Plague of 1655, and the equally tragic Great Fire of London. The prophecies of Mother Shipton have been published as a book, and one of them goes like so.
Carriages without horses shall go, and accidents fill the world with woe. Around the world thoughts shall fly in the twinkling of an eye. Underwater men shall walk, shall ride, shall sleep and talk. In the air men shall be seen, in white and black and in green. Iron in the water shall float, as easy as a wooden boat.
Many people interpret and claim that this particular prophecy indeed foreshadows our modern civilizations, referencing motor transportation, aircraft, submarines, and possibly even the internet with, "Around the world, thoughts should fly in the twinkling of an eye." I mean, if that doesn't sound like she predicted email, Twitter, and Instagram, I don't know what else will. Mother Shipton died in either 1561 or 1567, and is said to have been buried in unholy lands somewhere near York. There are people who believed her prophecies may have been exaggerated, and although we cannot be sure of how much of her story is true, what must be certain is that 500 years ago a woman called Ursula Shipton lived in Knaresborough, and that when she spoke, people believed her and passed her words on. If you're feeling daring, you can actually visit the cave in which Mother Shipton was born and witness how the mystical powers of the water turn anything it touches to stone. I'll link the attraction in the description, in case you want to walk the paths of Agatha and her daughter Ursula. The story of WALPURGA HAUSMÄNNIN is probably one of the scariest witch stories in the world, especially because of her graphic confessions. Just a warning before we dive in, this story is much darker than the previous ones. So again, like many witches from the past, little is actually known of when WALPURGA was born. But it is estimated that her date of birth was between 1510 and 1527 in Germany. In addition, there isn't really much information about her life growing up. WALPURGA comes into public attention during the period of the most famous witch trials in Germany. The little we do know is that WALPURGA was a licensed midwife in the city of Dillingen. She had practiced for over 19 years before she was arrested for sorcery. During her trial, she gave a confession which was definitely out of the norm. She said quite a lot, and I'm guessing much more than was expected of her. Perhaps this had to do with the fact that she was tortured. She began by stating that once she was widowed in 1556, she had arranged a romantic rendezvous with a co-worker. However, instead of a co-worker appearing, she claimed that apparently a demon called Ferdinand came instead, and they were intimate. Apparently the night after that, the demon Ferdinand came back and promised many great things to her. One of those things promised was to get her out of poverty. This, nevertheless, could only be possible if she swore and contracted herself to the devil himself. Surprisingly, WALPURGA agreed to these conditions, and so the demon Ferdinand took her on a pitchfork, and they flew to meet the devil face to face. She fancifully described the devil as a big man with a grey beard, wearing wealthy garments, who sat grandly on a chair like a great prince. The devil confirmed her contract, to which they celebrated by drinking wine, and this is a grotesque part, but apparently ate roasted babies and later copulated. She went further to describing participating in black masses, which, if you don't know what they are, essentially means a parody of Catholic Mass, to worship the devil, and the rituals include very bizarre actions. In Walpurga's case, the rituals involved stealing or violating the Blessed Sacrament by crushing the bread or urinating in the wine. Walpurga admitted that the devil would frequently visit her to sleep with her in the middle of the street, or even in prison, and he had even given her an ointment to use in order to hurt people, children, animals, and harvest. She admitted to horrific crimes, such as sacrificing over 40 babies before their baptism, while she was serving as a midwife. She claimed that she would drink the blood of these children, and in rituals with other witches, as well as eating the children, they would use the hair and bones of the deceased for sorcery. After admitting to her witchcraft, she was sentenced to her death by the local authorities and the church, which was under the Archbishop of Augsburg and the imperial court. Her fate was sealed, and the event was as disturbing as her confession. She was paraded through the city, where they stopped 6 times to torture and mutilate her, before reaching the place of execution. Once she reached the end, her right hand, which is also the hand she used to swear her oath as a midwife, was cut off, because of the atrocities she committed against her oath. After this, she was thrown alive into a pyre where she burnt to death. Her ashes were not collected for a proper burial. Instead, they were thrown into the closest flowing river, so that she could be forgotten. Obviously, it's important to say that many people, especially women, were falsely accused of witchcraft because their behavior or nature didn't fit the norm at the time. Thousands of people were tragically killed for sorcery. To give some perspective, between 1500 and 1660, up to 80,000 people were put to death in Europe. Of course, in cases like Walpurga HAUSMÄNNIN, she was definitely ill, and a murderer for hurting all those children. Her graphic confession and detailed accounts for the occult certainly left room to question her position and guilt. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed today's video, please be sure to drop a like and leave a comment with your thoughts. And perhaps we can hear more tales of witches, while we wait for Wizards Unite to be released. Any day now, sure enough. But for now, I'm going to sign off. Thanks for watching, and Wizards will unite in the next one.